George Washington's heart and mind were never far from Mount Vernon. Even as he commanded troops during the Revolutionary War and served as the first president of a new nation, Washington's thoughts were with his home.
Mount Vernon was always there as sort of a refuge for him, a place for him to go.
But 54 years after his death, Washington's home was in danger of being lost forever.
The farm was not doing well. The roof of the piazza was literally falling down. The columns were gone. There were broken ship's masts that were literally holding up the piazza. It was on the verge of being beyond saving.
It would take a group of extraordinary women to save George Washington's home.
I don't even want to think what Mount Vernon would be like if the ladies hadn't stepped in.
In 1853, Anne Pamela Cunningham received a letter from her mother. In it, she described the sad state of the home of America's first president. Her mother's words inspired Anne Pamela to take action.
She wrote a letter very early on that was published in a newspaper that made the call for preserving Mount Vernon and asking for support, and she didn't even sign it with her own name. She signed it a Southern matron because nice women in the 19th century didn't have their names in the newspapers.
Eventually, Miss Cunningham decided she would not be anonymous. She stepped forward and in 1853 founded the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. She would head the association as regent. Vice regents would come from states throughout the nation.
When Anne Pamela Cunningham established the Ladies Association, there really were very few models for her to follow. It was really a groundbreaking activity.
Together, they would find innovative ways to raise the funds to purchase Mount Vernon and see to it that the estate was preserved.
They had wonderful contacts. So it was that ability to reach to people who had great wealth, great influence, and then everyday people. The school children of America raised thousands and thousands of dollars.
4 years after the association was formed, the ladies had raised enough money for a down payment on the property. But Washington's nephew and heir, John Augustine Washington, wasn't sure he wanted to sell to women.
Because women just weren't supposed to have a public presence like that. They weren't supposed to be incorporating and dealing in large amounts of money.
Miss Cunningham's will prevailed. By 1860, the Ladies Association took full possession of Mount Vernon, opened it to the public, and began the work of restoring George Washington's home.
One advisor suggested that they shouldn't worry about any of the buildings other than the mansion and the tomb, because the mansion's where he lived and died, and the tomb is where he's buried, and everything else was unimportant. Even said that they're also associated with menials.
With their refusal to tear down the buildings and workspaces associated with slaves, the ladies set a precedent for preserving history.
The real innovation that Anne Pamela Cunningham brought to the preservation of Mount Vernon was the notion that it should be preserved and restored and presented just as George Washington knew it.
They really didn't have much to go on in the way of precedent and what was to be done, so they did what they thought was right. And I think history has proven that they were correct, and many other organizations, of course, have followed suit.
Only a handful of George Washington's belongings remained at Mount Vernon. The ladies furnished the rooms as best they could, with pieces reminiscent of Washington's era, while they searched for his original possessions. Their goal was to restore the estate to Washington's vision.
At the heart of this enterprise is a really radical notion. And the radical notion was that the history of everyday life should be preserved.
And the Mount Vernon Ladies Association would continue to set the pace for historic preservation. In 1880, California Vice Regent Phoebe Apperson Hearst financed a new wharf to receive visitors to Mount Vernon. In 1898, she supported construction of a new sea wall to end erosion and landslides. And in 1916, she persuaded the board to accept a proposal by Thomas Edison to electrify the estate. Influential men continued to support the association's work. In 1923, Henry Ford donated a made-to-order fire engine to ensure the safety of Mount Vernon. It was the world's most advanced firefighting technology. But technological progress sometimes threatened Mount Vernon. In 1955, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association learned that an oil tank farm was to be built directly across the Potomac, and George Washington's magnificent view would be lost forever. Ohio Vice Regent Francis Payne Bolton donated funds to buy 500 acres along the shoreline and started one of the country's first land trusts.
And you literally are seeing what George Washington saw, what inspired him as he stood there on the piazza with people like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Lafayette, and they planned and dreamed about the future of America.
Since those leaders visited, more than 80 million people have been inspired by these grounds. American presidents, first ladies, royalty, and leaders from around the world have come to see George Washington's home. And in 1979, the association took another advanced step toward determining what his home really looked like. They used the newest technology to identify the mansion's original paint colors from over 2,000 samples.
They were able to identify what those colors were over time, and most importantly, what the colors were in George Washington's lifetime.
It was an unexpected and dramatic change.
They tend to be very, very bright, very vibrant greens and blues, the kind of thing that was popular throughout the British Empire in the late 18th century.
The Mount Vernon Ladies Association continues to be faithful to George Washington's life and times. A replica of Washington's 16-sided treading barn was reconstructed. Designed by George Washington himself, it revolutionized wheat processing.
He was an innovative farmer, dedicated to experimenting with all sorts of new ideas on how to improve agriculture, because he knew that agriculture was going to be fundamental to the success of the new country that he was so prominent in founding.
Washington's entrepreneurship is also apparent in his reconstructed distillery.
Most people have no idea that Washington was first in war, first in peace, but also first in distilling.
Archaeological research revealed the remains of George Washington's blacksmith shop beneath the estate's ice house.
So we took away the ice house and have rebuilt the blacksmith shop on its original site so that visitors can come and see, blacksmithing as it was done 200 years ago.
And Washington's gardens are being restored to how they looked during his lifetime.
This is interpreting history. This is looking at the physical remains of the past and then trying to make sense of what remains in the soil and then bring it back so that visitors can experience what it was like in the 18th century.
There is no question that the Ladies Association preserved Washington's place in history. Somehow these women knew that there was something important about preserving this house, its gardens, and the fabric of everyday life.
George Washington's legacy lives on at Mount Vernon. Rescued from ruin, his home is a place to reflect upon America's past, draw inspiration, and continue to plan for America's future.